Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Martello. We're going to look at some examples from section 9.3, and this is on page 498 in the textbook. So before we start looking at the examples, I wrote down some notes that might be helpful for us when we're solving quadratics using square roots. So what we want to do first is we want to isolate the quantity that's being squared. So whatever is being squared, we want to get it by itself. So no number is being multiplied in front, no number is being added or subtracted behind it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to square root both sides of the equation. Remember that when you take the square root of a number, it equals the positive and the negative of that number. So don't forget that. This is probably the number one thing that people forget, is that positive or negative. And then if we have to, we need to solve. Sometimes we don't need to, sometimes we do. So let's take a look. Here's example 1. In example 1, it says we have 3x squared minus 27 equals 0. First thing we're going to do is get this x squared by itself. So let's add 27 to both sides. So we get 3x squared equals 27. And then we'll divide both sides by 3 to get x squared equals 9. Now from here, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of x squared, it just simply cancels out the square. I just get x. And I'm going to take the square root of 9. And notice how we're not forgetting that plus or minus symbol here. And we're going to take the square root of 9, which we know is 3. So our answer is positive and negative 3. You can write your answer like this, or you can split it up and say that x equals 3 and x equals negative 3. Let's take a look at letter B. X squared minus 10 equals negative 10. Let's isolate x squared. We're going to add 10 to both sides. We get x squared equals 0. And then from here, we're going to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of 0, it's only 0. There's no such thing as plus or minus 0, positive or negative 0. So this one only has one solution, just x equals 0. Let's look at letter C. We're going to isolate the x squared in negative 5x squared plus 11 equals 16. We would subtract 11 from both sides, get negative 5x equals 5. And then let's get rid of the negative 5 in front by dividing both sides by negative 5. I would get x squared equals negative 1. Now the next step would be to square root both sides, but I cannot take the square root of a negative number. So since I can't square root a negative number, that means that this answer has no real solutions. Okay, let's take a look at example 2. Okay, in example 2, we're going to have a quantity now that's being squared. This quantity is already by itself. There's nothing multiplied in front of it. There's nothing being added or subtracted behind it. So our first step to solve this is right away we're going to take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root, it just simply cancels out the square and we're just left with x minus 1. When we take the square root of 25, don't forget it's plus or minus 5. Now we have to solve for x. So we're going to add 1 to both sides and I get 1 with the plus or minus 5. So let's find our two answers. It would be 1 plus 5, which would be 6, and the other answer would be 1 minus 5, which would be negative 4. And those would be our two answers for this one. Okay, we're going to try some monitoring progress questions here. So let's take a look at monitoring progress number 1. I have negative 3x squared equals negative 75. Okay, my first step is I'm going to isolate the x squared. Let's divide both sides by negative 3. I get x squared equals positive 25. Okay, my next step is I need to solve for x. Let's get rid of the square. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root, it just simply cancels out the square here. So I just have x equals, and then don't forget the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5, positive and negative 5. You can leave your answer like this, or you can say that your answers are x equals 5 and x equals negative 5, if you want to write them separate, just like that. Let's do another one. We're going to take a look at monitoring progress number 3. I have 4x squared minus 15 equals negative 15. Okay, I'm going to isolate the x squared. So let's first start by adding 15 to both sides. Now I have 4x squared equals, on the right side over here, these end up equaling 0. And that's okay. 0 is an okay number to get. Let's keep going. I'm going to divide both sides by 4. I'm trying to get this x squared by itself. And then 0 divided by anything is just 0. Okay, next step is let's take the square root of both sides. And the square root of 0 is only 0. So this one only has one solution, whereas this one had 2 solutions. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Actually, I want to do number 2. I'm going to go back and take a look at number 2. Number 2 says x squared plus 12 equals 10. Okay, we're going to isolate the x squared. Let's subtract 12 from both sides. And I get x squared equals negative 2. Our next step would be to take the square root of both sides. However, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. Even if you try to put this in your calculator, it would say error or cannot compute or some kind of error message like that, because this is not possible. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. So that means here that this is no solution, or you can use the symbol for no solution that we've learned before, that circle with the line through it. Okay, so these are our possible options. We could have 2 solutions, 1 solution, or no solutions. Okay, let's take a look at another one. We're going to look at number 5. Number 5, we have 4 times the quantity of x minus 3 squared equals 9. Okay, I need to isolate the quantity being squared. This whole parentheses here, that's what's being squared. Let's get that by itself by getting rid of the 4. So let's divide 4 on both sides. So that leaves us with x minus 3 squared equals, now here you could divide these and turn them into a decimal if you want. I'm personally just going to leave it as a fraction. So let's just leave it as 9 over 4. Okay, we're ready to solve for x. So now I need to get rid of the square. I'm going to take the square root of both sides, and that's simply going to cancel out the square here. That's all it's going to do. We're going to be left with x minus 3. On the right side, we're using our property of square roots. Remember that this is really the same thing as saying the square root of 9 over the square root of 4. So I can take the square root of each one. Don't forget, plus or minus. This would be plus or minus 3 over 2. Okay, let's solve for x. So now I'm going to add 3 to both sides here. And this is where I'm going to find my answer. I'm going to have 3 plus or minus 3 over 2. So now let's find out what this equals. My first answer for x would be 3 plus 3 over 2, or I can make 3 over 2 1.5, same thing, and that would be 4.5. That would be the first answer. Or my second answer would be x equals 3 minus 3 over 2, or 1.5, and that would be 1.5. And those would be our 2 answers for this one. Okay, we're going to look at one more example. Let's look at example 3. So in this example, now we're approximating the solution. So we're not going to come out to being terminating decimals or integers. And that's okay. We're going to use the same process. So we have 4x squared minus 13 equals 15. So let's isolate x squared. We're going to add 13 to both sides to get 4x squared equals 28. And then we'll divide both sides by 4 to get x squared equals 7. Now we're going to solve for x. We're going to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of 7, it ends up being a decimal that doesn't end. It doesn't terminate. It doesn't repeat. It's an irrational number, and that's okay. And we're going to leave it as that plus or minus 2.65. We're rounding to the nearest hundredth because that's what the directions said. Let's do one like this. Let's take a look at monitoring progress number 7. X squared plus 8 equals 19. Okay, we're going to solve for x. So let's start by subtracting 8 from both sides. I get x squared equals 11. Okay, we're going to solve for x. We're going to take the square root of both sides, get rid of that square there. And here I get x equals plus or minus the square root of 11. Now I want to find out what this equals, so I'm going to actually put this into my calculator and I'm going to round to the nearest hundredth because that's what the problem said here. So we're going to take the square root of 11, and in our calculator you can see we could get here 3.32. So it's plus or minus 3.32. We can leave our answer like that, or we can write our two answers out as positive 3.32 and negative 3.32. And those would be our two answers.